GOP's messaging problem over the $1.8 billion anti-weaponizing fund. Good evening. Tonight, we are discussing a political battle that may define the next phase of Washington's war over the government power, accountability, and the future role of the federal justice system. And at the center of it all, a nearly $1.8 billion federally funded, quietly created as a part of a legal settlement involving President Donald Trump, the Internal Revenue Services, and allegations of government weaponization. Now, Republicans argue this fund represents long overdue accountability for Americans harmed by political targeting, selective prosecutions, unlawful investigations, and federal outreach. Democrats, meanwhile, have attempted to frame the proposal as a dangerous political motivated and potentially connected to compensation for the January 6th defendants. And somewhere in the middle of all of this political chaos, congressional Republicans have found themselves losing control of the messaging narrative, not necessarily because the policy itself lacked merit, but because many Republicans failed to explain it clearly. And in politics, if you don't define your legislation first, your opponents will gladly define it for you. Tonight, we break down what the Anti-Weaponization Fund actually is, why Congress once again recessed without fully defunding the Department of Homeland Security, why tensions exploded behind closed doors between Republican senators and Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, and why many Americans are increasingly frustrated with both political parties, because whether you're Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. The American people are exhausted watching Congress fight for itself, while ordinary citizens continue paying the price. The Anti-Weaponization Fund was established as a part of a settlement agreement in the federal case President Donald J. Trump versus Internal Revenue Services. The lawsuit stemmed from the highly controversial leak of President Trump's tax returns, a leak Republicans have long argued represented a severe abuse of federal authority and politically motivated attack against a sitting and later former president. Under the settlement agreement announced by the Department of Justice, President Trump, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, and the Trump Organization agreed to dismiss pending litigation in exchange for the creation of a formal claims processes designed to compensate Americans who suffer from the administration described as lawfare and political weaponization. Notably, the settlement does not provide direct monetary damages to President Trump himself. Instead, according to the DOJ announcement, the plaintiffs receive a formal apology while the federal government establishes a separate mechanism for other allegedly harmed by government abuse. The fund itself would receive approximately $1.776 billion from the Federal Judgment Fund, a permanent appropriation traditionally used by the Department of Justice to settle legal claims against the federal government. The program would operate through December 1st, 2028. It would be overseen by 5 members appointed by the Attorney General. Quarterly reports would be submitted to the Attorney General detailing who received relief and what compensation was rewarded. And importantly, unlike previous federal compensation funds, any unused money would revert back to the United States government. Now, Republicans supporting the measures argued this point is critical because they point directly to the Obama-era Keep Eagle statement, where hundreds of millions of dollars remaining funds were later distributed outside to nonprofit and organizations that were never personally filed claims. Supporters of the Anti-Weaponization Fund say this new structure attempts to prevent the exact scenario, but here's where Republicans made a major political mistake. They allowed confusion to replace clarity, and once confusion enters the political bloodstream, narratives begin forming almost immediately. Over the past several weeks, Democrats and media critics aggressively linked anti-weaponization fund to possibly compensate for individuals involved in the January 6th Capitol riot. Specifically, concerns emerging over whether individuals convicted of assaulting police officers could potentially submit claims. Now, according to the language publicly discussed surrounding the funds, nowhere does the proposal explicitly state that individuals who attack law enforcement officers would automatically qualify for compensation. That distinction matters a great deal, but during the reportedly heated closed-door meeting between Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and Republican senators, Blanche allegedly failed to clearly explain the legal structure and limitations of the program, and politically, That became disastrous because once senators themselves leave a meeting confused, the public confusion becomes extraordinarily worse. Several Senate Republicans, including some who already maintained strained relationship with President Trump, expressed frustration over the lack of clarity. Some ultimately opposed portions of the broader reconciliation framework altogether, and Democrats immediately seized on the uncertainty. Suddenly, instead of discussing alleged weaponization by federal agencies, the national conversation became centered around whether the January 6 defendants might receive taxpayer-funded compensation. That was the catastrophic messaging collapse of the Republicans. Because whether fair or not fair, politics is often determined not whether by the legislation actually says, but by what the public believes it says. Now, let us address the larger issue Republicans are trying to raise here. And frankly, it is an issue many of Americans, not just Republicans, increasingly believe deserve scrutiny. Did elements of the federal government become politicized during the Biden administration? Republicans argue the answer is unquestionably yes. They point to the unprecedented FBI raid at Mar-a-Lago. They point to the IRS leak involving President Trump's tax returns. They point to the aggressive investigation involving conservative activists, school board parents, pro-life demonstrators, and political opponents. They point to social media censorship controversies involving federal pressure campaigns against technology companies. They point to years of investigations tied to allegations of Russian collusions. Allegations that consume enormous political oxygen while ultimately failing to produce the conspiracy narrative many Americans were initially told existed. Now, Democrats strongly dispute many of these characterizations. They argue investigations involving President Trump and his associates were legally justified and conducted within the framework of federal law. And to be fair, not every investigation involving a political figure automatically constitutes weaponization. This is an important distinction, but what Republicans have successfully tapped into is a broader public fear. The federal power can become selectively enforced depending on the politics, and that fear is not limited to conservatives anymore. Increasingly, independents and even some Democrats have expressed concerns over the growing intersection between politics, intelligence agencies, prosecutors, and federal enforcement power. That concern is precisely why Republicans believe the anti-weaponization fund would resonate politically. The problem is that they failed to explain it effectively. And while Washington argued over politician optics, Congress once again recessed without passing a reconciliation bill that would have helped fund the Department of Homeland Security. And that reality has an enormous impact because regardless of where Americans stand politically, DHS funding impacts broader enforcement, counterterrorism operations, immigration processing, cyber defense, and national security preparedness. Republicans blame Democrats for politicizing the anti-weaponization fund and refusing to negotiate in good faith. Democrats accuse Republicans of attaching controversial provisions to must-pass legislation. And somewhere in between, the American people once again watch Congress leave town without solving an underlying problem. This is exactly why trust in Washington continues to collapse. Americans are tired of permanent political warfare, tired of performative outrage, tired of lawmakers treating governance like cable television entertainment. And frankly, many voters now believe both parties spend more time protecting political power than serving the people who elected them. Because at some point, whether you are a Republican or Democrat, the basic expectation should be this: Congress should actually govern. Now let's directly address the most controversial aspect of this debate. January 6th. No serious person dispute the law enforcement officers were assaulted during the Capitol riot. Those attacks were real, and individuals convicted of violent offenses should face legal accountability. But Republicans also argue another reality exists alongside the truth. Not every person investigated, prosecuted, or financially destroyed following January 6 committed acts of violence. Some individuals face years of legal battles, public backlash, financial devastation, and reputational ruin despite being charged with lesser offenses or nonviolent conduct. That distinction matters in the broader constitutional debate surrounding proportionality, prosecutorial distinction, and equal application of justice. Again, Nowhere in the language surrounding this fund does it explicitly state that the individuals who assaulted police officers are entitled to compensation, but because Republicans failed to aggressively clarify the point immediately, Democrats successfully shifted public perception, and politically, perception often becomes the reality. At its core, the entire situation reveals a larger Republicans' problem. The GOP frequently wins policy arguments with the base, but the loss of a broader communication battle nationally. Democrats simplified their message quickly. Republicans want taxpayer money for January 6 rioters. Simple, emotionally powerful, easy for the media to amplify. Meanwhile, Republicans respond with lengthy legal explanations about claims administration, federal precedent, and constitutional weaponization theories. That may work inside the Senate hearing room, but it does not work with a 30-second television clip. And when Republican senators themselves emerged frustrated after private meetings with the DOJ officials, it only reinforces the perception of disorganized. This is why messaging discipline matters, and frankly, Republicans continue understanding how quickly political narratives harden into modern media environments. At the end of the day, Americans can disagree over Donald Trump, they can disagree over January 6th, they can disagree over federal investigations, but what should not be controversial in this is that government power should never be weaponized against citizens based on politics, not under Democrats, not under Republicans, not under anyone. If Americans were improperly targeted, unlawfully surveilled, politically prosecuted, or financially destroyed through abuse of the government authority, they absolutely should be a lawful process of accountability and compensation. That principle should transcend party lines. But Republicans also need to understand something equally important. If you cannot explain your legislation clearly, your opponents will explain it for you. And this is exactly what happened here. Now, Congress has recessed yet again without fully resolving DHS funding concerns, while political warfare continues to consume Washington. And millions of Americans are left wondering whether anyone in the nation capital is still capable of putting the country ahead of political chaos. Because whether you're conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, Americans deserve leaders who work for the people, not merely for their party, their donors, or their next television appearance. And perhaps that is the larger story unfolding here. Not simply the creation of a $1.8 billion fund, but government increasingly consuming by mistrust, political retaliation, institutional skepticism, and permanent partisan conflict. The question now is whether Washington can still find its way back to accountability, transparency, and constitutional balance, or whether this cycle of escalating simply becomes America's new normal. I'm Haley Ficuciello, senior correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Good night.